There are very few states out of the 50 within the US that most foreigners would recognize. If you grab some random Frenchman and ask him which one is Nebraska, they would probably respond along the lines of, "What's a Nebraska?" However, even those with just a small knowledge of the good old US of A could probably point out Texas. I mean, just look at it. It's the biggest state. Well, second biggest state. And its culture and people seem forged almost separate from the rest of the US. And that's largely because, as most of you know, it was. Texas was its own sovereign republic for 10 whole years before becoming incorporated into the US. So what if instead they had remained independent? While most people within Texas were on board and advocated for American annexation, the US itself was not so confident. As many of you know, this was a pretty tense era of American history, as the anti-North and pro-slave South battled it out to try and undermine each other or at least maintain a balance of power between the two factions. Texas, being a southern land with a very pro-slavery population at the time, would have upset this balance. It was only when an expansionist Southern Democrat, James K. Polk, was elected president in 1844 that the U.S. was ready to annex Texas. Let us begin the alteration of history in Texas itself, in which, also during the year of 1844, the Texans were having an election of their own. In this timeline, Edward Burleson defeats Anson Jones. While this wouldn't stop enthusiasm within Texas for American annexation, it may just slow it down. Now we turn to the U.S., where a series of crucial elections go differently. First off, the U.S. presidential election of 1844. This was a race in which Polk defeated Henry Clay of the Whig Party 170 to 105 electoral votes. In this timeline, Clay is able to win Georgia, Virginia, and South Carolina, securing a 141 to 134 lead. Also, side tangent, South Carolina at this time didn't hold a public count to decide how to cast their electoral votes. Instead, that was fully decided by their state legislature. So if the state legislature was majority Whig, the whole state would have gone to Clay. Now, we just need to keep the Whigs, who were much more cautious about Texan annexation, in control. Next, we have the presidential election of 1848, an election in which the Whigs did very well and won. However, in this timeline, instead of Zachary Taylor winning the nomination, it would be Clay winning re-election. Without the disastrous presidency of Millard Fillmore, who only became president because of Taylor's death, the Whigs wouldn't completely fall apart in 1852. Not only this, but if Taylor didn't become president in 1848, he wouldn't have died from food poisoning he contracted during a presidential celebration, leaving the charismatic and popular Zachary Taylor to carry the Whigs to another win in 1952, an election which in our timeline saw the Whigs get completely destroyed, again because of Millard Fillmore leading the party into destruction. Lastly, this brings us to the U.S. election of 1856, which would see the emergence of the Northern Anti-Slavery Republican Party. With the Whigs still a popular force in American politics, it would become a tight three-way race. But with the Whigs having some base in the South and the Republicans having firm control over the North, I believe it isn't completely out of the question that we could see the Anti-Slavery Republican Party win the election 4 years earlier than in our own timeline. Seeing this, Southerners would panic just as they did in our timeline in 1861, and the American Civil War would begin 4 years earlier, acting as the final distraction and nail in the coffin for the notion of Texan annexation, and leaving the Lone Star State truly on its lonesome. As the decades went on, a feeling of Texan identity would develop more and more, until the idea of U.S. annexation within Texas would largely die out, leaving the Texan Democratic Party in complete control. Relevant policies of the party would include Texan nationalism, the support of a Texan identity, anti-nativism, and the continuation of slavery. As the Texan population begins to grow, so would tensions with their southern neighbor. You see, not only would Mexico not recognize the independence of Texas as a whole, but Texas would claim its border to be the Rio Grande River, far into Mexican territory. My prediction would be the development of a militaristic culture within Texas, as the independence they secured in their revolution would be under threat from a Mexican empire itching to reclaim their lost land. Beyond this, the young republic would find itself in a struggle for international recognition, specifically from Britain, France, the Netherlands, and Belgium. Texas was finally making gains in this regard at the time of its annexation, setting up financial relationships with the nations of Europe. But I believe their best bet would be a Frenchman struggling to live up to his uncle's legacy. Napoleon III was ambitious. Stupid, but ambitious. Mexico just so happened to be in the crosshairs of these ambitions, with Napoleon wanting to establish a French-friendly monarchy following the chaos of the Mexican Revolution in our timeline. Now, of course, in this timeline, without the Mexican-American War, the Mexican Revolution would most likely never happen, but Napoleon's interest in the region would remain nonetheless. And then there would be Texas, a golden opportunity, a small nation hungering for recognition who could be easily influenced and supported in a war with Mexico. And so, in the mid-1850s, Texas would finally get what they craved for so long, official recognition from a foreign power. A foreign power who would also support their claim of the Rio Grande border with Mexico. Tensions would explode between Texas and Mexico as the Texans are emboldened by the French support. With the French go-ahead, Texan armies marched towards the Rio Grande. At the same time, the French would land on Mexican soil, ready to take their own cut of the spoils. The result of the war is up to interpretation. The size of the Texan force would rely on the extent of population growth from the 40s to the war. The outcome also depends on whether or not Mexico could get support from, say, Britain. However, I don't believe the outcome of this war would be that globally consequential. Rather, what I believe would have a bigger impact would be the fact that the United States would only have about 2/3 of its continental lands than in our timeline, including, crucially, California. Safe to say the United States would be a less wealthy and powerful nation, but the extent of this is up for debate. If Mexico wins the war against Texas and France and reaps the benefits of the California gold rush, it might even find itself able to rival the United States in strength. The following decades leading up to the First World War, as well as the conflict itself, could either go very similarly or extremely different. With a Texas with strong French relations and Mexico hurting from theoretical concessions to France and the loss of even more territory to the Texans, we could see a North American front during the First World War. With the Entente distracted in Europe, this would truly be a mano-a-mano fight between these two rivals. However, if the US intervened on the side of the Entente like in our timeline, the North American theater would be even larger. And so, in conclusion, I would classify an independent Texan republic as a nation with potential. If things had gone perfect for Texas, they could have found themselves as an influential regional power in North America, maybe even taking the California region, which was claimed by Mirabeau B. Lamar, the third or second president of Texas, depending on how you count it. Or they could have been swept back into the fold by the larger Mexican Empire, in which they had originally seceded from, maybe somewhere in the middle. One thing's for sure, I probably pissed off a lot of Texans.